charger. Just like overwhelmed, freaking over schedule. Like I can't never sit down and relax. Trying to make time for the freaking Bible, even though I have like real busy schedules. Like I could never get a break.
Chapter 16. The Birth of Ishmael. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian servant and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abram replied, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." Then he added, "I will give you more descendants than you can count." And the angel also said, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives." After Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her, she said, "You are the God who sees me." She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Ber-Lahairoi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born.
So, Genesis chapter 16, verse 1-3. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham as a servant wife, a common practice at that time. A married woman who could not have children was shamed by her peers and would often give a female servant to her husband in order to produce heirs. The children born to the servant woman were considered the children of the wife. Abraham and Sarah were acting in line with the custom of the day, but their actions showed a lack of faith that God would fulfill his promise. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 3, Sarah took matters into her own hands by giving Hagar to Abraham like Abraham. She had trouble believing God's promise, which was apparently directed specifically toward Abraham and Sarah. Out of this lack of faith came a series of problems. This frequently happens when we take over for God, trying to make his promise come true through efforts that are not in line with his directions. In this case, time has the greatest test of Abraham and Sarah's willingness to let God work in their lives. Sometimes we too must simply wait. When we ask God for something and have to wait, we can be tempted to take matters into our own hands and intervene with God's plans. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 5, although Sarah was arranged for Hagar to have a child by Abraham, she later blamed Abraham for the results. It is often easier to strike out in frustration and accuse someone else than to admit an error and ask for forgiveness. Adam and Eve did the same thing in Genesis chapter 3, verse 12, verse 13. And then it says, Genesis chapter 16, verse 6, Sarah was angry with Abraham because she blamed him for her problems with Hagar. In her anger, she treated Hagar harshly enough to cause her to run away. Anger, especially when it rises from our own shortcomings, can be dangerous. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 7, verse 16, Hagar was soon to be an abandoned single mother. She had no voice, power, or authority. Once a slave, then a woman of privilege, carrying Abraham's child. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 4. She was understandably angry to be treated again as a slave. By her plight, it led to a deeper spiritual awakening. And the angel spoke to her personally, saying that the Lord noticed her and heard her distress. The spirits led Hagar to call God. You are the God who sees me, no matter how deep your troubles or how big a mess your family is in. God notices you and hears you and brings good out of your desperate prayers. Genesis chapter 16, verse 8, 9, Hagar was running away from her mistress and her problem. The angel of the Lord gave her this advice. Number 1, to return and face Sarah, the cause of her problem. And 2, to submit to her. Hagar needed to work on her attitude towards Sarah, no matter how justified it may have been. Running away from problems rarely solves them. It is wise to return to our problems. Face them squarely, accept God's promise of help, correct our problems, correct our attitudes, and act as we should. Genesis chapter 16, verse 13, and we have watched 3 people make serious mistakes. First, Sarah, who took matters into her own hands and had her husband sleep with another woman because she wanted a child and didn't wait on God and didn't trust God. And that's where the difficulty came. Having other women intervene with your relationship. And that's how it comes with polygamy. Like, when you're sharing women, like, it's always like a freaking issue. Sharing a freaking man, you're gonna have problems, like, difficultly. That's why you're gonna be faithful to one woman, and be with one woman, and be faithful. Looking at other women just because you think it's going to be better, just because she has like better breasts or a better body. You're going to find somebody better, but you're probably not going to find somebody with the same mindset. Just because they have a nice body, it doesn't mean anything, because when you get older, you're going to use that anyway. We don't seek to find a spouse because of their outer appearance, really, but it is good to find somebody that's good looking, whatever, handsome, etc. But you're just out there like sleeping with people, using them, taking advantage of them, and doing all types of stuff, and forgetting that person, and you just use that person for their body. It shows how low class you have. Low class people in this world, how they think, culture minded, to sleep with you, and they're further to one night stands and stuff like that. It's worldly culture, but we as Christians are supposed to think differently, even though it's hard to walk into God's ways. At times we fall and we fail, we mess up, we're human beings. Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn the world. He came into to save salvation, shed his blood for our sins. But once you're a Christian, you're change your fruit of how you walk in this world. When you become a Christian, you want to do what God says. When you become a Christian, you don't want to stay in a lifestyle, even though you fail at times. I don't know if that makes sense. But we have watched these people, three people, make serious mistakes. Sarah, who took matters into her own hands and gave her servant to Abraham. To Abraham, who went along with the plan, but when circumstances began to go wrong, refuses to help solve the problem. And 3, Hagar, who ran away from the problem in spite of this messy situation. God demonstrated his ability to work in all things to bring about good. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Sarah and Abraham still received the son they so desperately wanted, and God solved Hagar's problems despite Abraham's refusal to get involved in. No problem is too complicated for God if you are willing to let him help you. You raise a good point about the story in Genesis 16 where Abraham allows his wife Sarah to have for serving Hagar, resulting in consequences that stem from not fully trusting in God's plan. Lack of faith in God's promise. God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son in here despite their events. Age. Genesis chapter 15, verse 4, verse 5. However, when Sarah remained childless, they took matters into their own hand rather than waiting on God's timing and provision. And second, human attempts to help God. Sarah suggests that Abraham sleep with her servant Hagar in order to produce and hear. Genesis chapter 16, verse 2. This reflects a lack of faith that God would fulfill his promise in his own way and time, and free the consequences of that situation of impatience and disobedience. Once Hagar became pregnant, tensions and resentment arose between the two women. Genesis chapter 16, verse 4-5. This leads to conflict, discord, and a fractured family dynamic, consequences that could have been avoided by trusting in God, overlooking God's sovereignty, and taking the situation into their own hands. Abraham and Sarah failed to recognize God's power and control over the circumstances. They tried to help God out rather than resting in his perfect timing and plan. The overreaching lesson is that when we try to force our own solutions instead of waiting on the Lord, it often leads to negative consequences and complications. The story highlights the importance of having unwavering faith in God's promises and timing, even when circumstances seem to contradict what he said. Your insight about the lack of trust in God being the root of cause is absolutely right. Abraham and Sarah's decision to rob Hagar was a failure to fully believe that God would fulfill his word in his own way. This is the common temptation we all face when we grow impatient with God's timing. And the takeaway is that we must resist the urge to help God out. Instead, remain steadfast in our faith, trusting that he is working all things according to his perfect timing. As Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, in purpose, lessons like this from the book of Genesis continue to speak powerfully to our need. For example, we look to them and learn from the situations for a revering trust and sovereignty of God. You make an excellent observation about how the cultural norms and values of today often clash with the biblical perspective of marriage and relationships. The story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar in Genesis 16 is a prime example of how the cultural practices of the ancient Near East, such as polygamy and sacred motherhood, created a complex family dynamics that deviated from God's original design for marriage. Number one, God designed for marriage. In Genesis 2, God clearly establishes marriage as a lifelong monogamous covenant between one man and one woman. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. This reflects the creator idea pattern for human relationships and the flourishing of families. And number two, culture norms versus biblical principles. The ancient Near Eastern culture in which Abraham lived normalized practices like polygamy, concubinage, and use of sugar mothers. However, these cultural norms did not align with God's revealed will and ended up leading to strife, jealousy, and brokenness in Abraham's household. The consequences of the compromise, as you noted in Abraham's decision to sleep with Hagar, as Sarah's suggestion, shows how he compromised God's design in an attempt to help fulfill the divine promise. This compromise has serious relational and familial consequences that reverberated for generations. In the reconciling faith culture and culture versus culture, today we still face the challenge of reconciling culture values and norms with the timeless principles of Scripture. Practices like cohabitation, open marriages, and serial monogamy may be socially accepted, but they contradict God's plan. Practices like cohabitation, open marriages, and serial, where we know monogamy, like being with one person, it's not a sin, but multiple people, like the culture, hookup culture, may be socially accepted, but like, the lesson here is that we must be discerning and willing to go against culture trends when they conflict with biblical truth. While the world may celebrate and promote relationships models at odds with God's design, followers of Christ are called to uphold the sanctity of marriage and family. Cultural influences have corrupted God's intent. Encourage them to live according to the Creator's perfect plan. It's a challenging but essential task as we seek to honor the Lord around the nations that are going against biblical marriage, hookup culture. Honor the Lord in our most intimate relationships. Polygamy, how do you spell that? You make an excellent point. The key issue is not simply the practice of polygamy itself, but rather the way some have tried to justify it using selective Bible interpretation that takes verses out of context. You're absolutely right that the Bible's clear teaching is that God's design for marriage is between one man and one woman. Practices like polygamy, while present in certain biblical narratives, are never endorsed or upheld as the ideal. Description versus prescription. The Bible often describes the realities and cultural norms of its historical context without necessarily prescribing or approving of them. The fact that figures like Abraham, Jacob, and David had multiple wives does not mean the Bible sanctifies that practice. addressing specific situations. In some cases, the Bible may address part of the situations, polygamy, without necessarily condoning the practice in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 15, verse 17. But this does not mean the Bible considers pornography to be God's idea for marriage. Jesus in the New Testament, Jesus Christ affirmed Genesis 2 definition of marriage as between one man and one woman in Matthew chapter 19, verse 4, verse 6. The New Testament epistles also consistently uphold monogamous marriage as norm for believers. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, verse 12. Titus chapter 1, 6. And you're absolutely right that some have tried to twist or misinterpret certain biblical passages in order to justify unbiblical relationship practices like pornogamy. This is a serious mishandling of the Bible scriptures that fails to account for the Bible's overall teaching and redemptive context. The Bible's clear witness is that God's design for marriage is one man and one woman. In any attempts to refine or change his world, distort the truth, are unbiblical and should be rejected by the church.